Stress, stress, stress. It is probably one of the most common terms that we hear in our daily life. As a kid, I remember every morning my mom used to say, "Getting you ready for school is my biggest stress." You can imagine, I am well aware of the word. I was a very notorious kid, to be honest, but that's a secret. But now that I think about it, I realize that stress is not understood in the truest meaning, and people tend to see stress in the negative light. But is it the fact? Is stress really something that is only harmful to our performance? Let's start the podcast by asking ourselves the question, what is stress? You may pause the video and may take a moment for yourself to think about your own definition of stress because everyone might have their own definition of stress, right?
All right, I'm going to assume you took a moment and enlighten yourself with your own definition of stress. Whenever the term stress pops up, we tend to associate it with being under pressure and not having enough resources to cope in a situation when the demand is very high and the supply is kind of low. As an athlete, you may feel stress when you're trying to maintain training sessions with other personal commitments or the pressure of upcoming competitions along with studies. Personally speaking, thinking about studies always gives me stress. But is that really the reality? Technically, it's not wrong. Stress is perceived by everyone differently, and in some situations, stress can help with increasing motivation and productivity. This is what differentiates between eustress and distress. You might not be familiar with eustress yet. So eustress is the stress element that leads to an increased sense of motivation, purpose, and productivity. Everyone has that one friend who does not study for the semester and then still manages to get all that information in one night and do really well in the exam, right? But maybe we also know someone who studies throughout the entire semester and then just doesn't really do well, because that's when kind of distress comes in and you can't really perform under the pressure of the situation.
The second question that pops up in our head now is, how do you feel stress? And how can stress affect your everyday life and performance?
There's a misconception about stress that it's only a psychological phenomenon and only affects the mood of the person. But the reality is that stress might have psychological as well as physiological consequences. Stress can be observed by self-assessing your own body. So it can be felt in your mood, energy, thoughts, and even in your muscles. You might have noticed that in a stressful situation, our mood and emotions keep fluctuating. But have you ever wondered why you feel maybe a pull in your shoulder or in your lower back? These are common muscle groups that are affected by stress. As already mentioned, eustress can have a positive effect on your performance. This can come in different forms, such as increased motivation, goal orientation, and active engagement or productivity in relation to the things you've got going on. On the other hand, under distress, your performance may be negatively affected. This can be due to procrastination and avoiding to deal with things that you've got going on, like work assignments or even dropping training sessions. Distress can also come with demotivation or even increased worries about events like competitions. And then under chronic stress, like if this continues over a longer time frame, it may lead into cardiovascular diseases, anxiety, depression, and burnout. And once you develop those, you will very likely not be able to perform in your sport at all.
Now that we know what stress is and how stress affects our performance, the real question that arises is, how do I manage or adjust my stress?
So far, we've understood that stress is not always bad for us. In fact, eustress is beneficial to improve motivation and efficiency of performance. So the main motive of stress management is not eliminating the element of stress from our lives, but to reduce distress factors and increase eustress factors. Everyone has their own way of dealing with stress. So take a moment for yourself and think about the specific things that you do at times of stress. You can pause the video now and take some time to think about some of the strategies that you use. All right, so I'll assume you took a moment and maybe wrote some notes down to think about what you do when you're under stress. So stress can be your friend and your enemy, and it depends on how you look at stress. For example, there was an interesting study in the US that found people who experienced a huge amount of stress and thought that stress was bad for their health had a higher death rate than people who were also under a lot of stress but believed that stress was good for their health, or at least not bad. So it's interesting that it differs so much just depending on our belief about stress. Following from that, our heart rate is also a lot higher in terms of stress. So when we view stress, it tends to be that our arteries contract, and that is harmful to our performance because our blood can't deliver oxygen to the brain or the muscles. But when we believe that stress is not harmful to performance, our blood vessels do not contract, even though heart rate is higher. And then in those situations, you actually get more oxygen to the brain and your muscles, which can be very good for performance. That's basically what underlies these eustress effects. So when we're thinking about stress management, we're trying to get you to think differently about stress and believe that the stress effects you're having can actually be good as well. A lot of preparing for stress and setting yourself up for adapting to it comes down to organizing your life properly. If you know you have a plan that leaves you enough time for training sessions next to work, you'll get some time for yourself that will make you feel a lot better than going into a period of pressure without a plan. Sure, this is fairly boring and a bit obvious, but setting up your calendar for different things you need to get done in a certain time frame can really help you manage. So when you have some deadlines coming up, write down everything you need to get done for those, and I mean everything. This can be a bit daunting, but once you have that list, you can kind of estimate how long you take to get these things done, and then you can properly plan everything into your life together with times for yourself where you get a break from these things. So stay realistic when you're doing that. It doesn't really help if you're estimating less time, end up needing more time, and then you get stressed about that. Make sure you take breaks in, because nobody can work 24/7, and basically don't stress yourself out about getting stressed. Even if you have everything planned through, you can get into situations where you just feel pressured and everything gets a little bit too much. Maybe your body tenses up, even subconsciously. Those situations happen and you can't really completely avoid them. What you can do is prepare for them. So you need to have a plan for when that kind of situation comes up. One way of dealing with those situations is using relaxation techniques. These techniques are set out to relax your body or mind and calm down the tension in your muscles or the whirling thoughts in your brain. While that all sounds great, also be aware that tension before training and competitions is not necessarily bad. As with eustress, tension can actually facilitate your performance in some instances, which is why you need to play around with relaxation techniques at home and training before you use them in any competitions. So maybe you figure out that you find these techniques really helpful at home to just kind of calm down at the end of the day, but then in training and competitions just lowers your performance. If that's the case, that's absolutely fine. You just use them at home and stick to other things at training and competitions. For our workshops, we'll teach you progressive muscle relaxations. This is a physical relaxation technique, and it's focused on reducing muscle tension. Essentially, what you do is slightly tensing your muscle groups and then actively releasing that tension. That way you can release tension in muscle groups that you might have been tensing up the entire time. This can happen all the time subconsciously if you're under stress, so it can help you relax. We'll provide more detail on how you actually do this in our workshop, so please have a look out for those. But now that you've listened to this, maybe reflect on what you've learned from the presentation. Do you think stress is an enemy, or could it be a friend as well? We've also provided some more links to YouTube videos that relate to stress management, which we found very interesting. So if you find this interesting and want to find out a bit more, you can check those out. But for now, thank you very much for listening, and we hope to see you in our workshops.